So, Ed, how large is this cluster getting now, and are authorities any closer to finding the source?
Hey, Paul, good morning. We're still waiting for the latest figures that'll be out in a little over an hour from New South Wales State Premier Gladys Berejiklian. The latest figures, though, is that the cluster has grown to 122 people. It's been rising gradually by about 6 or 7 a day, and thankfully a fair proportion of those are positive cases, people who have already been self-isolating. Now, by international standards, those numbers are tiny, but you have to remember we're coming off a completely different baseline than the US or Europe, for instance. Australia had virtually eliminated COVID-19. That was down to stringent testing, contact tracing, and also closing our international borders. And life had pretty much returned to normal for us here, particularly in Sydney. And so seeing this kind of rising cases has really shocked people. The only cases we'd had for weeks were returned overseas travellers who were forced to quarantine in special hotels. Now, authorities are still investigating the source of the Sydney cluster, but previous outbreaks, down in Victoria, where Melbourne was forced into that 3-month lockdown, and then more recently, South Australia, the source was lapses at quarantine hotels where cleaners or security guards had become infected.
So how about the restrictions that were put in place over Christmas? Have people been obeying those?
I'd say by and large, yes. About 250,000 people in the Northern Beaches region have been ordered to stay home, except for essential work, provisions or exercise. Whilst they were allowed some reprieve over Christmas and allowed between 5 and 10 people in their homes, they've been told again until at least December 30th that they can't have any visitors in their homes. More broadly across this city of 5 million people, residents have been urged to limit their activities. State Premier Gladys Berejiklian, for instance, asked people to avoid the Boxing Day shopping sales in the city, for instance. Not everyone's been complying, though. We saw instances on Christmas Day where hundreds of revellers gathered on Bronte Beach. That's a popular beach in the eastern suburbs, and police had to break up those crowds. The State Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, described that as appalling behaviour and said it had the potential to be a seeding event.
Well, there's a big question for a lot of international viewers who might be rather used to watching Sydney ring in the new year, one of the first major cities to do so. Is that going to happen on New Year's Eve?
Well, the good news is, yes, there will definitely be fireworks. We'll have about a 7-minute display at midnight with the usual backdrop of the Harbour Bridge and Opera House. Authorities here, very much know that we're watched all over the world, and this year in particular will be a symbol of hope that 2021 will bring a little bit better news than this year. What we're still waiting to hear, though, is what kind of gatherings will be allowed. Before this cluster, authorities were planning a scaled-back event. We certainly weren't expecting the hundreds of thousands of people who gather along the harbour foreshore for a view. And they were planning to have special access for emergency services, and health workers as a reward for all the work they've done this year, tackling the bushfires that started the year here down under, and then, of course, the health workers who've been working so hard throughout the pandemic. Now, we'll know later today whether those limited gatherings will be allowed to go ahead and just how strict police will be in stopping other people lining the harbour foreshore on New Year's Eve.
Ed, one thing we were hoping to hear news on in the first quarter of 2021 was a potential travel bubble with New Zealand. Have we heard at all how this latest outbreak in Sydney might have affected those plans?
Well, that travel bubble has been very much on again, off again, hasn't it? We were getting quite optimistic, I think, a couple of weeks ago that New Zealand was beginning to look more favourably at the bubble. Of course, New Zealand has had an even better track record than Australia in containing community transmission. And whilst New Zealand has been allowed to travel to Australia without quarantining, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has been very clear that any people returning or any Australians making the other trip would still have to quarantine. And one can only imagine that this cluster in Sydney has probably thrown a spanner in the works there and at least delayed some of the preparations. You know, you have to remember in our own country here in Australia, this cluster has seen states and territories across the nation, Queensland, Western Australia, Tasmania, pull up the drawbridge again and renew those border restrictions. So effectively 5 million people across Greater Sydney are now not allowed to leave the state and travel anywhere else in Australia. So it would probably be unrealistic to expect New Zealand to welcome us with open arms at the moment without quarantine.